The room was never meant to change, not in front of presidents, prime ministers, and the giants who shaped global power, yet on that morning, something shifted, not through anger, not even through volume, but through clarity. A small, landlocked nation stepped into a space designed for global superpowers, and with one sentence, Ibrahim Traoré broke a silence many Africans had carried for decades, a silence about who truly represents a continent of more than 1 billion people. Burkina Faso came to their G20 only as an observer, a symbolic seat among the world's major economies, but Africa in 2025 was no longer the Africa of the past. New alliances were rising in the Sahel, younger generations were demanding dignity instead of charity, and the old political patterns were beginning to crumble. So when Traoré spoke, leaders didn't just hear a speech, they recognized a moment, because beneath all the polished formalities of global diplomacy lies a deeper question: how can Africa move forward if Africans don't feel represented? At G20 meetings, things usually follow a predictable script: big powers talk, small nations listen, but in November 2025, that script changed. Burkina Faso did not talk about begging for aid or repeating old talking points. Traoré spoke about representation, sovereignty, and the distance between African citizens and the institutions meant to give them a voice. He wasn't attacking anyone, he was asking questions, questions too real to ignore. Africa had changed. Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger had formed a new Sahel alliance built on sovereignty and local control. Burkina Faso started rebuilding industries, taking more ownership of its resources, and trying to break away from economic dependence. These changes were not perfect, but they were intentional. They were steps toward self-determination. That was the energy Traoré brought to the G20 stage. Delegates expected the usual diplomatic tone, but Traoré started with something different: representation. Not the representation written in official documents, but the representation people live every day. He questioned how institutions can claim neutrality when silence often protects the powerful. He asked why unity should come from political elites instead of African communities. He wondered why African history remains fragmented, why African education depends on material written abroad, and why African democracy is still measured by standards created outside the continent. Point by point, he held up a mirror, not accusing anyone, simply asking Africa to confront itself. The whole grew silent, because this wasn't just a leader speaking, it was a generation speaking. For decades, Africa was discussed as a region of crisis, conflict, and instability, but under the surface, something else was happening. People reclaiming agency, rebuilding identity, refusing the roles written for them by outsiders. Traoré questioned not Africa's institutions themselves, but whether those institutions still represent Africans, and the world listened. As soon as he finished, reactions spread across the continent and the diaspora. Governments were cautious, some nervous, but African youth reacted immediately. Clips went viral, debates exploded, and young Africans, for the first time in a long time, recognized their own voice on a global stage. The speech exposed something long avoided: the legitimacy gap. Institutions built decades ago no longer match the expectations of citizens living today. But their speech wasn't just criticism, it was a blueprint that began with the Sahel, where sovereignty, cooperation, and self-reliance are being tested and practiced in real time. This moment forced Africa's major institutions to rethink themselves. Can they reform? Can they reconnect with the people? Can they rebuild trust? Because legitimacy isn't inherited, it must be earned. Africa now stands at a crossroads. One path rebuilds existing institutions to better serve the people. The other builds new alliances from the ground up. Both are possible, both demand courage and long-term commitment, but they point toward the same destination, an Africa that speaks with its own voice. So the real question remains: who has the right to speak for Africa? Institutions? Governments? Or the African people themselves? When the microphones switched off and leaders left the room, the speech didn't end, it began. It traveled far beyond the G20 hall, across Africa, across the diaspora, across families, classrooms, and communities, because this moment wasn't about a speech, it was about a continent asking itself who it wants to become. Africa today is not silent. Africa is choosing the tone of its future, and that future will be written not by those who wait for permission, but by those who are ready to build, question, and rise. Meanwhile, global powers were forced to pay attention, not because of confrontation, but because the tone had shifted. For decades, Africa was approached through aid programs, humanitarian language, and crisis-based policies, but now the conversation moved toward dignity, partnership, and equal footing. This wasn't about isolation, it was about sovereignty, about cooperation built on respect, not dependency. And here is the turning point. Africa is no longer asking, will someone save us? Africa is now asking, what are we capable of building for ourselves? Governments noticed this shift. Institutions felt it, young people embraced it, the diaspora amplified it. A movement had started, not with protests, not with weapons, but with questions, questions powerful enough to reshape identity. Across African countries, people began demanding more transparency, more accountability, and more participation in decision-making. Suddenly, political systems built decades ago began to look old, distant, and outdated, and the truth became unavoidable. A continent cannot be represented by systems that people no longer trust. Real representation isn't symbolic, it's lived. It exists in classrooms, in agriculture, in economic strategy, in cultural preservation, and in educating young people about who they are, not just who they are told to be. Across the continent, a new generation is rising, one that refuses to inherit old limitations, one that believes Africa's future doesn't have to copy anyone else's path. This generation is not waiting for change, it is becoming the change, and soon the world will realize something. Africa is no longer entering the conversation, Africa is reshaping it.